Tim Wilson, thanks so much for joining me. First, the vilification of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the threats, the calls that she not come to Australia. What is that saying about Australia today?
Well, it sends a very negative message about the state of free and open discussion in Australia when somebody who's just standing up for their genuinely held belief and from their own life experience is now facing significant protests to the point that they're not able to get up and give public speeches. All Australians should condemn that sort of outcome. It doesn't matter whether you agree with her or you disagree with her. If we're able to hear different ideas and challenge our own thinking, we need provocative speakers.
Look, I wonder whether there's something going on, Tim, because we've seen violent protests and threats against Pauline Hanson, Cory Bernardi, a simple book launch of my own. Is this a trend, and is it concerning you?
It concerns me greatly, Andrew, and it's a reflection of what happens when modern left progressive activists think that either violence or threats of violence or intimidation are a way of dealing with public debate by silencing and censoring people who disagree with them. This is not the left of the progressive left of the past that has always looked at defending freedom of speech and a contest of ideas. Instead, rather than debating the ideas, they just try and silence their opponents. This is a very disturbing trend in Australian society. It's been happening in university campuses, in other Western liberal democracies, and it will not end well. Once upon a time, these people thought of speaking truth to power. Today, they just want to silence any truth.
But this is now being backed, of course, with the sort of wider terror of free speech. It's almost like that, a wider terror of free speech in the left, with Labor, for instance, demanding we not reform the Racial Discrimination Act, which has been used by activists to punish and intimidate critics of this new race-based politics we're seeing. Can you understand why the left has suddenly turned so much towards censorship, and including, I have to say, same-sex marriage advocates too are into this business?
Well, I think it's a very small section of the community who advocate marriage for same-sex couples who want to silence differing opinions. But I think what we have seen is the growth of left progressive identity politics. And that's when, if there's an issue that offends somebody or challenges people's conventional thinking, the solution, rather than debating it or getting a microscope and looking into society and identifying positives and negatives, is simply to shut down discussion if it runs contrary to the left progressive narrative. And it comes up on all sorts of issues, and sometimes deeply hypocritically. We saw this last week where Anne Ali, a Labor MP, said, we couldn't possibly remove the test of whether it was unlawful to offend somebody on the basis of race. Then she went out and argued that we should extend it to religion, until she realised it would amount to a national anti-blasphemy law, and then turned around and said, oh, no, we've got to be able to debate religion. It's this inconsistency. Whatever works for them at the time and is consistent with advancing their agenda or their values, but there's a huge cost, because in the end, other minority groups, whether we like it or not, sometimes demonise other minority groups, and that's why we always have to be free to debate ideas and difficult issues, even when it does offend or insult people. And there's nothing worse than installing political correctness in law, which is what we have under 18C.
Now, Anne Ali, I just wonder whether she was on her own in this, in the Labor Party, to be honest, where she says, let's look at extending somehow the reach of the Racial Discrimination Act to religious abuse, which sounds all right, well, might sound to some all right in principle, but will be used to say, well, look, you've actually offended my faith, which is, that goes into a blasphemy law. But is she out on her own? I mean, I've been worried about some of the things that Labor's Shadow Attorney General Mark Dreyfus has been saying.
Well, Andrew, I think it's very important to be clear about exactly what Anne Ali was talking about. She wasn't talking about religious abuse or religious harassment. She was talking about whether somebody would be offended on the basis of religion. Nobody disputes that people should be free of harassment in society and free from types of abuse. But when people want to express challenging or difficult or offending ideas, they should be free to do so. But what we've seen is Anne Ali wants to make it unlawful to offend somebody on the basis of religion. religion. She's now backtracked from that, but she can't explain why one group shouldn't be offended and why one should be able to be offended. And what we've seen at an event at the Jewish community in Melbourne is Mark Dreyfus, the Shadow Attorney General, saying he'd like to take 18C and apply across the board. So you'd have national anti-blasphemy laws where you couldn't offend somebody on the basis of religion. You would then concurrently have laws which would make it unlawful to offend somebody on the basis of sexual orientation. So we couldn't debate the issue of marriage for same-sex couples. That's why you've got to raise the standard and the test in law, which is around harassment, which is what the Turnbull government recommended, because it's a standard and a test that can be applied consistently and all Australians can be treated equally before the law while keeping every debate, every issue open for discussion.
Tim, this is starting to freak me out because you've got, almost like a meeting of the circle here. You've got on the left, you've got people wanting to use the law and sometimes street violence too to shut down debate. On the right, at least the Islamist right, you've got the same attempts to shut down free speech through the law or through violence, real or threatened. This is, to me, look, you've got a history in this area. I feel it's something relatively new to our generation and serious, or is it always been with us?
No, I think there have always been people who have challenged whether you need to stand up for free speech when it becomes difficult, but you always have to remember that you don't need to defend free speech from the excessive use of please and thank you. It's only when people cross the line of social acceptability and normality. But what I do think is we now see a sickness in parts of society where people don't want to hear challenging or difficult ideas that offend them. It's coming out partly through the school system, but particularly at university where you've got trigger warnings, deplatforming or non-platforming of people who get up and say things that might challenge university students. And what we're seeing is across the board an acculturation of the idea that people can be free from offence or free from things that they don't want to hear. Now, once people get out of those closeted environments, reality sets in and people realise that, you have to engage in free thought and discussion. But there are some people who never leave that bubble, and they're the people who try and impose their value set through universities and public institutions on the whole of society to everybody's detriment.
It's starting to scare me, and in particular, on the weekend, Tim, Gillian Triggs, President of the Human Rights Council, your former boss, said she claims there had never been a more important time to defend laws which prohibit racial abuse in public. And then she said this: sadly, you can say what you like around the kitchen table at home. Tim, sadly, we are free to say what we like around the kitchen tables. What kind of thinking is driving this Human Rights Commission under Gillian Triggs that it's sad that we can say things at home?
Well, Andrew, I've resisted the temptation to provide a running commentary on Professor Triggs in her capacity as president, but I can say I was absolutely shocked and astonished when I heard that quote. People should firstly be free to say whatever they like in their own homes without the thought police coming in and trying to tell people what they can say. That's sort of 1984-ish type mentality. But even in the public square, people should be able to reasonably exercise their opinion and stand up and speak out their truths. When you don't allow people to do that, the problems don't go away. The resentment and issues continue to build within people. But more than that, we all as a society suffer. And this is the hardest thing to explain to people. As a society, we suffer when we censor and silence differing or challenging opinions. People should be free from abuse and harassment. But that is not the same. That is not the same for standing up merely for things that some people might take exception to or find challenging or difficult.
People have got to look at what Gillian Triggs said, mate, because I can only see how that law gets enforced. I mean, if you start getting kids dobbing in their parents. Tim Wilson, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.